Hello, and welcome to the Hamumu Halloween Home Horror Hoedown,
the podcast where we watch 31 horror movies throughout the hallowed month of October.
Ranging from the critically acclaimed to film school projects gone gruesomely awry.
And we take them all way too seriously.
I'm your host, Mike Hummel.
And I'm your host, Sully Hummel.
Now warning, we use a ghoulish number of spoilers, so watch the movies first.
Second warning, we don't know anything about anything, so don't take us seriously while we take these movies seriously. Today, we are talking about the movie His House from 2020. This is actually an evil twin to the earlier movie that we reviewed this month, Girl House.
And I feel like it would be impossible to get a more exact opposite to a movie.
Yeah, like this polar opposites on every scale.
Yes.
Literally every scale. His House is the story of a couple that has fled Sudan or South Sudan. We don't really find out for sure, I don't think. But we do know that they speak Dinka, which is the language of a group in South Sudan and Sudan. But they are fleeing the violence there, the warring between two groups, that they talk about this during the movie. And they end up in England. And this is the story of them starting over in this new country, right? And they're given a house, and they are told by the immigration people that they are being accepted as asylum seekers and that they must live in a house of their choosing. They are not allowed to make any other money besides the, small
74 pounds a week.
74 pounds a week that they're given. And they must not miss one appointment.
Yes.
And because we're watching a horror movie, that one of those three things, or perhaps all of those three things, who knows, is going to become an issue, right?
Yeah.
Did you know which one was going to become an issue?
Well, it's called His House, so...
yeah.
Yeah, there's an issue with the house. They don't want to be in this house, but they have to stay. And it creates an interesting thing you don't see in horror movies where the idea that they could just leave is out.
Right.
They've got to stay in this house.
Well, it really ups the ante. Like, there's always a reason, right? There's always your rich dead uncle says that you can have this house.
Spend the night.
Or you can have all of his money if you spend a night in this haunted house. And they're like, we're going to stick it out. And then there's always the point where they're like, yeah, no, thank you.
Right.
It's not worth it. This movie takes that, like, why are they staying, and ramps it up to 1,000.
Yeah, they basically have to deal with the unknown ghostly terror or be sent back to human shooting terror.
In fact, the woman, Rial, at one point says, you think I can be afraid of ghosts after what we've seen that men can do? Like, she's just like, I'm not afraid of this stuff. Yeah. Whereas Bull is afraid, but we find out later that there is more reason for him to be more afraid of what's going on.
That's weird, yeah.
Okay, so there are definitely going to be spoilers, and this is definitely going to be a movie that I rate highly. I don't know about you. So I just want to remind all of our viewers that if you want to enjoy this movie free of us telling you what's coming and ruining some of the art of the movie, I guess, the value of the movie, go watch it first before you listen to the rest of this.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We learn early on that they lost a daughter, while they were crossing a sea during their journey, right? And we see this traumatic, all these different things that they go through on their journey.
But then towards the end, they reveal to us that that's not really their daughter.
No.
And that's pretty scummy, which you have to understand the scumminess is that they were trying to get on a bus in Sudan to get out of things while guys were rolling into the village with guns, killing everybody. They're like, we want to get on. They're like, no, only kids. And they were like, this is our kid. And they grabbed some little girl.
It was like the wife in Clown, where she's just like, here's an unsupervised child. I can use it for whatever purpose I want.
Yeah.
He literally was just like, yeah, this one's mine. And he picked one up And they were like, all right, get on. And they let the three of them get on.
Yeah, which is something else, man. That changes the sympathy levels in this movie.
Well, I mean, it does. And it doesn't. Like, to me, it just magnified the terror that they must have been feeling in that moment. Because these were good people. They were people in very tough circumstances. Right. I mean,
understandable.
Outside of, we're on the verge. We know that we are about to be horrifically murdered by men with huge guns, you know, in very painful ways. Like, outside of that, these were really decent, good people. They were normal people, is the thing. And for him to make that decision and for her to go along with it,
I know,
were two things where I'm like, these people were so terrified.
There was a lot of tension between them.
Well, for obvious reasons, which weren't obvious at first, which was interesting. So they basically kidnap this child and use her as their ticket out. And then they fail to protect her.
Yeah.
During their journey. And even more so, the fact that they lost her, I think, played into why they were given asylum-seeking status.
Probably, yeah.
Because they mention that, you know, they're the immigration people are like whispering to each other and they're like, oh, they lost her, you know, whatever. So like there's all this guilt around this girl. But then even later at the end, we find out that Rial had been pregnant and had lost a pregnancy. And so suddenly then it sort of made sense to me why she went along with what her husband was doing, where like she was not only afraid that she was going to die, but she also was really messed up over, you know, she had lost the potential of a daughter. Like she had been told she was carrying a daughter and that now she had no daughter and she was just totally screwed up because of that too. Then all the women that she's hanging out with who are supporting her during this are all murdered by mercenaries.
Yeah.
While she hides in a cupboard.
Sole survivor.
Yes. Like, this movie is just nonstop survivor guilt.
Yeah. And PTSD, which is represented early on, is like, wow. Yeah.
Yes. One of my notes was that, is the house haunted or is this PTSD? Like, that was an early question for me.
I mean, I guess you don't really know. They're the only people who ever interact with the ghosts.
Right. And I think, like, I've had some conversations with friends about how really everything that we think of as ghosts, like all the stories about ghosts, when you think about them in terms of PTSD or mental health issues, that Venn diagram is mostly a circle.
Yeah, it makes sense. And the thing people don't really think about or realize, or maybe a lot of people don't even know, is that hallucinations are common. Like,
yes,
everybody has them sometimes.
Yes.
And so you think you see something that's not there and that's out there. That's an extreme situation, but it happens. And when you're under a lot of stress and difficult situations, then you're going to see stuff.
Right. Because it's our brain interpreting things. Like we get input and our brain is like, oh, here's what happened. And we respond to that as if that's a thing we know.
Yeah. And if your brain is all fired up on all cylinders, it's going to have some crazy ideas about what just happened.
Right. And the problem is when it's your brain giving you the ideas, it's really hard to argue against that. We can't even argue against that when it's someone else's stupid brain giving us dumb ideas.
It does happen.
Yeah. There's trauma, there's PTSD, there's survivor guilt, there's all this stuff. And they are in another country being told that they're going to be sent back to all of the things that have caused these feelings in them if they don't assimilate, if they're not one of the good ones, which is an actual phrase that was used by
Doctor Who.
Yes. By one of the immigration people, like the guy who's checking up on them.
Well, and they're in this new country and all that, and it being one of the good ones. So that in itself is a pressure, but also there's a bunch of different racist things happening to them that are making their lives difficult and weird, and that they have to grin and bear it because of that. You're going to go home if you do it wrong.
Right. And literally grin and bear it. Like, there are
Yes.
multiple times throughout the movie where one or the other, or both of them, plaster these pleasant smiles on their faces because they know that's what the people looking at them want to see, or that's the only thing that will get them out of the situation that they are currently in.
Yeah.
It was so uncomfortable for me to watch that because it was done really well. Like, the scene was acted really well, but also because I just kept thinking about all the times that happens in real life.
Oh, yeah.
And not just to people who have gone through all of that horrific trauma. Like, that is just the way so many people in this country have to live. And I realized that was in England, and, but I don't know England the same way. And then I think about how many times I mistook somebody being friendly or looking happy to me and misread a situation where they were really uncomfortable or unhappy and didn't feel safe telling me. And obviously, I don't know when that has happened. I can't tell you this is a time because I was oblivious.
Right.
It just makes me wonder how many times I was oblivious and misread somebody's smile. And it was interesting to see how the two of them approached that differently. Because Bowl was very much like, he's like, we just need to assimilate. He buys the clothes at the store that exactly match the guy on the wall, like the advertisement. He goes to the local pub. He sings the pub songs, even though he doesn't really, I don't think he really knew what he was singing about. No. Or if he knew, he didn't agree necessarily. He was just like, this is how I fit in.
Yeah, he totally was. He was making an extreme effort to assimilate.
Yes.
And Rial was the opposite.
Yes. And she, largely she just stayed home. But also, she went to the grocery store and she came home and she's trying to cook food like they would have back at home. Only the only bread she has, or the only bread she can afford on her 74 pounds a week, is this crappy white hamburger buns, right?
Hamburger buns.
And you can just see her, she makes this meal and she's eating it the traditional way with her fingers and, taking the bread and dipping it in the other parts of the meal. And Bowl is here's the silverware. We have to eat, with forks and stuff. And as she puts it in her mouth even, she's just you could see the acting was so good right there because you could see the grimace on her face, even though it wasn't super obvious. It was just, that was fantastic to me. I thought that was such a good scene.
She said she could only taste the metal. And I'm like, I never even thought about that.
Uh-huh.
I'm sure you can taste the metal of a fork. Why not? I've tasted metal before.
But we don't, because we have been eating off of metal forks our entire lives.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was very strange. So even in addressing the haunting that's happening, they're both seeing this dead girl and they're both seeing all these other dead people and, really horrible things are happening. And their Bowl is this isn't real. This isn't happening, whatever. And then Rial is she's well, makes perfect sense. She tells us a traditional story.
Yeah.
That her mother had told her, which I thought was really good timing because it made sense within the context of that point of the movie. But then later when we realize, because it's about a guy who stole in order to build the house that he wanted. And I was oh, here's the, titular thing. And then later we find out that they stole the girl. And I was like, oh, yes, that is amazing. Think about that.
Yeah.
But she's tying it all to her tradition and culture and interpreting it in a totally different way. And he's just flat out rejecting all of that.
Well, and she's making peace with it. She's talking to the ghosts and discussing what's going on with them, which kind of supports the idea that there are no ghosts, that she is trying to reconcile with what they did and he is denying and hiding away, fighting against it.
But even if there were ghosts, it would make sense to me that these ghosts were trying to tell them something, and when she's listening to them, they respond differently to her, whereas he's pretending they don't exist and they're trying to kill him.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's so much complexity there that was just very well told and very well acted, and all came together beautifully. But as I was watching them, all I could think was how absolutely soul destroying it would be to live in that house. Because that house, it had holes in the wall. The electricity wasn't hooked up properly. Like the lights didn't work in most of the rooms. You know, the wallpaper was all torn off. And like they are trying to make it livable by having the ratty furniture that was left there and the dirty sheets that was left there. And like they moved into that house and there were still pizza boxes full of old, gross, maggoty food in that. Like at the bare minimum, they couldn't get one person to come through and remove the garbage from this house before they moved them in. Yeah. And they get this sense of superiority because, oh, look, we've given you this thing for free.
It's a perpetuating thing where you treat them like less and give them, you know, this bad situation, low end thing, and then treat them like they're dirty and whatever because you've made them dirty.
Because they live in filth. Because that's where you've told them they have to live. And they're not allowed to make any money or find another place
That's the crazy
or anything.
bit. You're not allowed to get a job and make more money. Like, what?
Because Rial and Ball wanted to make that place better. Like they were spending portions of the little bit of money they had to improve on this place that they hadn't destroyed. Like to fix what someone else had done. So they had this pride and they wanted to do the right thing, even though they were being expected to do the right thing with no resources and no support. It's very upsetting and it's gross to me. You know, how often people are like, oh, myself included. I'm like, oh, I've donated this bag of old clothes to, you know, the women's shelter in town. It's like, I used to just take everything that I didn't want and have this mentality of like, somebody will want this. And now I give them the stuff that is still wearable or the things that like I bought it and I never wore it because it turned out I didn't like the way it fit or the way it felt or whatever. And I'm like, this is a brand new thing or a thing that's in good shape. Like so often I hear people who work in those kinds of areas and that get donations and they're like, we just get a bunch of clothes that have, you know, all these gross pit stains in them and, you know, spills all over them. And it's just, it's very upsetting. And I think we let ourselves off the hook because we can explain it away with like, well, they didn't have this before. Ugh.
But it is tricky because like you said, you get something, you've got something. So I mean, when you think about, oh, I'm just going to throw this out instead of giving it away. What if somebody needs it? You know?
I mean, it's true. I think the real problem is that we give away these things that aren't good enough for ourselves anymore, and then we judge them for using things that aren't as good as the things that we have.
Yeah.
You know,
that's a huge
it's
problem.
that perpetuating piece that you were talking about before. And it's just this idea that we are better and we deserve better because we've made better life choices, when in fact it was just that we were born in a different family. Like we were born into a whole set of privileges that other people
It's got nothing to do with anything except luck.
Right. And then carrying that idea of, you know, oh, well, we're doing such a great thing by helping somebody who is less than us. Whether we're willing to say that out loud or not, there's always that idea that someone is less than us if they don't have the same things we have.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. And
that's like baked into us.
And that was part of what they were doing. Like, Doctor Who was like, no ball games, no balls. And it was like, there's no reason for that rule at all. They just want you to disappear. They want you to not be there. Stop existing because it's a problem.
Especially if you're going to exist out in the world where we have to watch you and then we have to be like, why are they being so loud or why are they doing it like that? And, you know, we have to confront differences or, you know, things that make us uncomfortable.
Yeah. You should just not be around so we don't have to see you.
Yeah. So in the end, Bull finally decides to accept. Like, he decides to accept that he can't stop being who he is. He can't stop being from where he is. Like, he spends the whole movie denying his culture and his past and his decisions. And he finally is just like, okay, I'm going to take responsibility. I'm going to accept, that this Apeth, the Night Witch, is real. And he decides to sacrifice himself, because the whole idea is, if you give us yourself, then we will give you your daughter back, is the deal that the Apeth is giving him. So he decides to do that. He decides to sacrifice himself. And then Rial, who is getting this girl back, who's not her daughter, but who is her daughter now, like, she feels responsible for her. She's getting her daughter back, and she realizes that it's a tainted deal, basically, right? She realizes she's making a deal with the devil, basically. And she sacrifices by choosing to say no to the deal.
Well, here's an interpretation, Soli.
Okay.
He is accepting his guilt, and she, who has been cold to him this whole time, which there's a whole part where he locks her in the house that is pretty intense. Mm-hmm. But anyway, she is accepting his acceptance of the guilt, and she is forgiving him. Mm-hmm. And now they can move on with this forgiveness. And I mean, I feel like that's kind of what's happening, and not so much any of the other stuff. Like, it's the resolution of their relationship.
Right. Definitely. And whether all those other things are real or not, we don't know. In terms of, as far as the story goes, they are real.
Yeah.
But I absolutely agree that that's what's happening, is they are moving past these traumas that, to me, when I think about them, like, they're unimaginable. Like, I cannot imagine just going on with life, like normal life, after the things that they have experienced. And again, that made me realize how many refugees there are from how many different places in the world where they have experienced things that I can't even imagine surviving. And then they just have to live their lives.
Well, and then they go and they start a business, and they make a life, and they coach a soccer team,
And they can't talk about any of it because they're surrounded by people like me who find the whole thing so unfathomable that it's just more painful to talk about it. If they were within their own culture of people who had shared these experiences, you could have, it could be more cathartic, and you could talk about it. I think there could be more healing, but instead they come to our cultures, and along with us being like, you should be grateful for our garbage, we're also like, but don't talk about the things you've been through because it makes me very uncomfortable.
Right. They brought that in with when Rial went to the doctor. The nurse was, taking her blood and stuff, and she was not telling her anything at first, but finally she's just like, all right, whatever. My daughter's dead, and there's two tribes, and they kill each other on sight, and they mark themselves, and I marked myself with both so that I wouldn't get killed by both.
Right. And the nurse is just wide-eyed, has no response.
That is outside the realm of anything we could imagine dealing with.
Yeah. And so it's just trauma on top of trauma, and then all wrapped up in a package of don't talk about it.
You got to assimilate. You got to go along to get along.
Yeah. And then, people get mad that they people come to our country and only hang out with other people who have also come from the same places. It's well, of course they do. Those are the people who have even a small chance of understanding anything about who they are and what they're doing and what they're surviving.
Yeah.
This movie made me think a lot about the large population of refugees from Somalia that live in Minneapolis. In fact, I just looked it up, and Minneapolis has more Somalis than any other city in the United States. That is one of the large refugee populations in Minnesota. And that same thing, it's that whole idea of, I have no idea what they've been through beyond these very sterilized, generalized, white savior kind of stories.
Yeah.
And this movie obviously was completely different in the details, but I think the idea behind it is similar, and it's given me kind of a different perspective about that.
to get less political, the end part of this movie, like the last quarter of it or so, it gets weird. It really changes what's going on to where suddenly the two of them sort of dive into the past. And like, it's just like they walk out the door and they're in the past, and it's flashbacks basically, but they're there. And it's hard to follow. It's hard to reconcile, what that means. Although at one point, Rial comes in and finds Bull just sitting there like he's peed his pants. He's just blanked out. And so clearly they're just kind of lost mentally. But I don't know, it became difficult to tell what was really going on because of that. And it was weird, but it got us that's how we learned about their daughter that they stole. I don't know. It was just very weird and hard to follow.
I noticed that as well. Although I don't think I found it quite as hard as you did. It's like with any ghost story. The question is always what's really happening and what's in their heads. And so anytime we're watching movies with ghosts in them, I'm just like, regardless of whether this is real or not, this is how we're learning about the background of these people.
Sure. Yeah.
But what I noticed, what it really reminded me of was the discussions I've had over the last year about storytelling and culture. And how in our culture, we have this 3-act storytelling pattern that we are all familiar with because it's how all of our stories are told. And that pattern is not the same pattern that other cultures use. And I have experienced that with stories from Asian cultures because there's a very, they don't do the whole conflict thing that we do. Every story we have is built around conflict. Yeah. And that's not the pattern that they use. And I don't know enough about the storytelling patterns of African cultures, which I'm sure are diverse in and amongst themselves.
Presumably, yeah.
To know what was going on in this story and how it was being told. But I definitely felt like it wasn't exactly following American plot patterns. And it felt familiar to me from some of the African stories that I have read. There's a book called Lagoon by a Nigerian author, Nnedi Okorafor, which I read and was fascinated by, but I'm very certain I did not understand the story. I understood the surface level, exactly what was being described to me, but I have no idea what was actually going on because I didn't understand the interactions. I didn't understand the pacing of it. And I do not have the background knowledge of African mythology to understand the symbolism of the different things that were happening. There was a whole thing about this road and a spider, and when I did some research afterwards, that is a huge mythological story that if you are from certain cultures is part of your heritage, sort of Thor is part of my heritage. So this movie felt a little like that. The whole Apeth, Night Witch piece is outside the realm of my experience of storytelling.
Yeah. But she did explain it, which was, I think they threw that in there.
Yes.
This was not meant for an African audience. This is for everybody.
Yes. And I think that they, the story that she told, I think it was anglicized a little bit to make it more understandable because it probably wouldn't have been told that way. There were things they wouldn't have had to explain because of culture. That
was a part I totally noticed when she said, it was an Apeth. And then I'm like, gee, I don't know what that is, but I assume I'll get it from context. And then she immediately goes, a night witch. And I'm like, really? You had to tell him that?
Right. Well, and even just within the story, it's the guy who is desperate and steals, and that's a bad thing. Basically, it was capitalism. And I think within... I think they had to explain how, he was desperate and it was a bad kind of stealing, because I think probably in the Sudanese culture, they wouldn't have had to explain that because, I don't know. I don't know it well enough, but I feel like there was probably some explanation there to make capitalist brains understand the story in a way they might not have it if it had been told in the traditional sense.
Probably, yeah. I'm sure there was a lot to it.
But that's okay. You're supposed to do whatever, I don't know.
And that whole scene would have just been her being like, this is like the story about the Opeth, remember?
Right. There is also that. Yeah, so it definitely reminded me that other cultures tell stories in different ways, and that, we have to work a little bit harder to understand them, which is one of my favorite things about watching the movies that we watch.
We do end up seeing a lot of different cultures in our movies, yeah.
Yeah.
Doing
not
this
so
project.
Not so much this year, because MovieBot...
It actually has been a bunch this year. Some new ones, too. We've had... I was just editing a Norwegian movie we watched, Cadaver. We've had some really new ones.
Oh, there's the Belgian one.
2 Belgian movies for some reason.
Huh.
Yeah, New Zealand.
Australia.
Yeah, we're covering that whole area. 2 French movies. We haven't
Are
hit those
up.
Yet, but they're coming. Canadian, of course, that are distant neighbors to the north.
The Indigenous movie.
Yeah, that was one of the Canadian movies. That was definitely from a different culture.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that the more you go into that discomfort zone of, but this is a story I don't understand. I don't get why these people are interacting the way they are. The more you sit in that, the more you start to understand it, which is something that we as people who have always been part of the majority of any group that we've been in have not had to experience often. Like, we have to seek out those experiences.
For sure.
As opposed to, like, the Somalian refugees in Minneapolis who are living that experience constantly as they try to figure out what the heck is going on with American culture.
I try to figure that out, too. So, Sully, first thing you're going to have to consider here is, was this better or worse than Girl House? You're going to have to think about that.
So you're asking me, does this movie deserve more than a 0?
Or less than a 0?
His House is so far removed from Girl House that it doesn't even seem fair to compare them.
Yeah.
We've had a few movies pairs so far this month where they were very different. This is by far the most different.
Yeah, I think so.
That is definitely going to show in my rating, because His House is going to be my second 5+ of the month.
I don't want to hear you complaining that I didn't bring you good movies with MovieBot. 2 5+? Come on.
Okay, but if we were to, like, average out the scores, this month has a much lower average, I would guess, than other years. There is nothing I didn't like about this movie. I thought the acting was fantastic.
Yeah.
I thought the story was told well. I liked what it made me think about. I liked that it made me uncomfortable. I liked that it made me learn things. Everything about it was good. And it was one of those, like, great meldings of horror. Like, there were ghosts and monsters and jump scares and all of that stuff that comes with horror, but also, like, psychological exploration and, all of that meaty, good trauma processing yumminess. So it really blended those things together really well, which is why it is getting 5+ seaweed covered wall ropes out of 5.
Yeah. Well, I am torn on my rating. Is this better than Girl House? That's the real question.
Shut up.
I don't know whether to give 5 or 5+ seaweed covered wall ropes.
What's the difference in your mind between a 5 and a 5+?
Perfection.
And where was this movie lacking?
I don't think it was lacking. I think in honor of important filmmaking, I will award this a full 5+ seaweed covered wall ropes out of 5. It might only be a 5, but we're gonna do the 5+ because I feel like it would be good for people to have this experience and really think about other people and whether they're important or not.
All right. I want to be clear that my 5+ is not a low 5+. My 5+ is a high 5+, and it is not just because I feel like it's educational. Like, I thought the
Right.
movie was really well done.
I did too.
And then you add in this movie is the kind of story that helps make the world a better place. And to me, that's what makes a 5+. Like, that connecting people through storytelling in a way that Girl House did not manage to do.
Did not? Did it not connect you with incels?
No.
All right. Well, I feel like that statement is where we need to end this because that's bold.
Bold. All right. We will be done with that. And tell me what we are watching next.
This is what I'm so excited about, this pairing. We're starting off with Japanese found footage.
Ooh.
Noroi the Curse from 2005. And I Googled this so I can tell you that Noroi means the curse.
So it's the curse.
I think they were just being helpful to the English audience.
Yeah. Okay, Japanese found footage is what we usually see way too much of because this is Mikey's wheelhouse.
This is a good wheelhouse to be spinning around in, if you ask me.
And what are we pairing this with?
Well, Solange.
Yeah, I've seen the tag.
Since it's called don't look at I just put that tag on. You shouldn't see that. Since the first movie was called The Curse,
Yes.
our other movie is called The Curse.
Ooh.
And it's from 1987, which is definitely going to be good.
Yikes.
And here's the real trick.
Uh-huh. Bring it on.
This movie, I don't think I want to spoil it. I think I want you to be surprised when you see this movie. There is something very special about this movie. You are going to watch this movie with me.
I'm not sure that I trust you because I see that you very clearly tagged the evil twin with the Lovecraft tag.
I wish I hadn't done that. It is definitely based on a Lovecraft story. I could even tell you which one, but I'm not gonna.
It wouldn't matter because I don't retain them in my brain.
Good. But that's not what's special, and you're gonna not even worry about that because you're gonna be so excited about the special thing about this movie.
All right. Well, that gives me a lot of interesting things to look forward to.
It sure does.
And I'm sure I will have things to say about it tomorrow.
Me too. Me too. Have we just been getting meaner?
Yeah.
Yes, we have. Consistently meaner every year. More discerning.